Welcome to the Real Crime Diary, Daily Dose of Crime. I'm your host, Sean Dupree. Today we dive into a chilling story that forces us to question the very systems designed to protect domestic violence victims. What happens when restraining orders, police intervention, and the justice system itself fail to prevent a tragedy that everyone saw coming? In Loudoun County, Virginia, Regina Redman told her loved ones she knew her husband would kill her. She just didn't know when. 6 days after her abuser was released on bond, her haunting prediction came true in one of the most devastating ways imaginable. How could a system designed to protect victims like Regina fail so catastrophically? And what does this tell us about the state of domestic violence protection in our country? Regina Redman's story begins like many others with a relationship that turned increasingly violent over time. Her marriage to Peter Lollobrigida had become a living nightmare, marked by years of abuse that would eventually lead to its tragic conclusion in 2021. But before we get to that devastating end, we need to understand how the justice system's decisions in the days leading up to her death would seal her fate. On July 23, 2021, Lollobrigida was arrested on domestic assault charges. For Regina and her family, this arrest should have been a turning point, a moment when the system would finally step in and protect her from her abuser. A protective order was put in place, theoretically creating a shield of safety around Regina. But what happened next would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. Under the previous Commonwealth's Attorney's Office administration, a decision was made that would have devastating consequences. Despite Lollobrigida's history of violence and Regina's desperate pleas for protection, he was released from custody while awaiting trial. Think about that for a moment. A man with a documented history of domestic violence, whose wife lived in constant fear of him, was allowed to walk free. How many red flags need to be present before the system recognizes the imminent danger to a victim? The clock was now ticking. Regina had just 6 days left to live. 6 days during which the protective order, that piece of paper meant to keep her safe, would prove tragically inadequate against a determined abuser. Could anyone have predicted how quickly this decision to release Lollobrigida would lead to catastrophe? Just 6 days after his release, what happened next would shock even the most seasoned law enforcement officers. On July 29, 2021, the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office received a chilling 911 call. On the other end of the line was Peter Lollobrigida himself, calmly stating that he had just killed his wife. When deputies arrived at the scene, they found Regina Redman lying unconscious in a hallway, her body bearing the marks of a savage attack. Next to her lay the murder weapon, a hammer, covered in blood. The brutality of the assault was evident, leaving no doubt about the attacker's intentions. But Regina wasn't dead, at least not yet. She was clinging to life, fighting with the same determination that had characterized her entire struggle against abuse. Emergency responders rushed Regina to the hospital, where medical teams worked tirelessly to save her life. For an agonizing week, she remained on life support, her family holding on to hope that somehow she would pull through. But the injuries were too severe. After 7 days of fighting, Regina Redman was removed from life support, marking the final act of violence in a relationship that had been defined by it. Think about the deliberate nature of this attack. This wasn't a crime of passion or a split-second decision. Lollobrigida had violated his protective order, armed himself with a hammer, and carried out this brutal assault with clear intent. How does someone go from being released on bond to committing such a heinous act in less than a week? What does this tell us about the nature of domestic violence and the very real dangers victims face even with legal protections in place? Behind Regina Redman's tragic death lies the story of an extraordinary woman, whose life was characterized by resilience, generosity, and an unwavering spirit. Through the heartfelt testimony of her aunt, Robin Chase, we get a glimpse of who Regina truly was, a fighter who endured years of abuse but never lost her capacity for kindness. Regina was known for her boundless generosity. She would share her food with anyone who needed it, ensuring no one around her went hungry. When she learned someone couldn't afford concert tickets, she would quietly purchase extra ones, making sure they didn't miss out on life's joys. These small acts of kindness paint a picture of a woman who, despite facing her own battles, never stopped thinking about others. But beneath this generous spirit lay a harsh reality that Regina lived with every day. She confided in her aunt about the years of abuse she suffered at Lollobrigid's hands. In one particularly chilling conversation, she made a prediction that would tragically come true. "I know he's going to kill me," she told her aunt, "I just don't know when." These words now hang heavy in the air, a testament to how well she understood the danger she was in. Perhaps what makes this story even more heartbreaking is that Regina fought until the very end. Even after the brutal attack, she held on for days in the hospital, showing the same determination that had helped her survive years of abuse. She wanted to live, to continue helping others, to keep sharing her light with the world. But how many other Reginas are out there right now, living with the same terrible certainty about their fate? How many more victims must predict their own deaths before our system learns to truly protect them? The wheels of justice turned slowly on that October afternoon, but they did turn. In a dramatic display of defiance, Lollobrigida initially refused to appear for his own sentencing hearing. But Judge Matthew P. Snow wasn't having any of it. Instead of proceeding without the defendant, he ordered the sheriff's office to bring Lollobrigida to the courthouse within the hour. The message was clear: this day of reckoning would not be delayed. When Lollobrigida finally stood before the court, his words rang hollow. "I think I'm a good person that did a bad thing," he said, while his public defender Adam Pouliard assured the court of his client's remorse. But Commonwealth Attorney Bob Anderson cut through these assertions with a stark reality: this was a case that never should have happened. The system's failures were laid bare in Anderson's critique of the decision to release Lollobrigida on bond after his initial arrest for domestic assault. "Individuals that repeat violence need to be controlled," he stated, emphasizing that decisions about pretrial detention should consider three crucial factors: the history of conduct, the severity of the crime, and the wishes of the victim. In this case, all three should have raised red flags. Judge Snow's final decision was unequivocal: 85 years in prison. For the 52-year-old Lollobrigida, it amounts to a life sentence. The judge acknowledged that while a plea agreement had shortened the legal process, there was no truly good outcome possible in a case like this. But one has to wonder if the system had acted differently during those crucial 6 days between Lollobrigida's release and Regina's murder. Could this tragedy have been prevented? And how many other potential victims are out there right now, released on bond despite clear warning signs? This case forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our justice system's approach to domestic violence. When we look at the timeline, just 6 days between Lollobrigida's release and Regina's murder, we have to ask ourselves, how many red flags need to be waving before we take decisive action to protect victims? The harsh reality is that Regina Redman's story is not unique. Across our country, domestic violence victims are often left vulnerable by the very system designed to protect them. When someone tells us they know their abuser is going to kill them, as Regina did, why do we still hesitate to act? Why do we still err on the side of an abuser's freedom rather than a victim's safety? This case highlights a critical gap in our pretrial detention protocols. The decision to release someone accused of domestic violence shouldn't just be a matter of routine procedure. It needs to be a carefully weighted choice that takes into account the victim's fears, the accused's history of violence, and the potential for escalation. Because as we've seen here, the consequences of getting it wrong can be fatal. Perhaps most troubling is how this tragedy could have been prevented with different decision-making at key moments. The warning signs were there: the history of abuse, Regina's own predictions, the recent violent incident. Yet somehow, these red flags weren't enough to keep Lollobrigida in custody. How many similar cases are playing out right now in courtrooms across America? How many more victims are watching their abusers walk free, counting down the days until their worst fears might become reality? As we close today's episode of The Real Crime Diary, I'm left wondering, how many Regina Redmans are out there right now, living in fear, waiting for help that may come too late? Her story isn't just a tragedy, it's a wake-up call for all of us about the critical gaps in our domestic violence response system. What changes do you think need to be made to better protect domestic violence victims? Should prior threats and abuse history carry more weight in bond decisions? How can we ensure that when victims speak up about their fears, they're not just heard, but actually protected? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could spark important conversations about reforming these broken systems. And make sure you're subscribed to the Real Crime Diary. Tomorrow we'll be examining another case that challenges our understanding of justice in America. Until then, I'm Sean Dupree, reminding you that the first step toward change is breaking the silence.
Hey listeners, welcome back to the Real Crime Diary. I'm your host, Sean Dupree. If you tuned in last time, we had a deep dive into the disturbing history of power abuse across different eras, looking at the connection between dominance, control, and how it plays out even today. We touched on scandals from the past and compared them with some modern-day examples, showing how these patterns of abuse, unfortunately, persist. One of the most insightful tools we've explored to understand this is my book, Power, Pleasure, and Pain, a study of abuse through time. It's not just a historical account, but an interdisciplinary approach to understanding why this keeps happening. We draw from history, philosophy, and modern case studies to explain how figures like Dominique Pellico, Harvey Weinstein, and others have exploited their positions of power for their own gain, often protected by the very systems meant to stop them. Recap of last interaction. In our last live stream, we discussed how libertinism, philosophically introduced by figures like Marquis de Sade, has shaped the way power and pleasure have been entangled throughout history. This concept ties directly into how figures like Weinstein operated, as we saw parallels between de Sade's fictional characters and the way powerful men manipulated their victims in real life. You guys had some amazing comments, asking how societal structures have allowed these behaviors to go unchecked for so long. It's a crucial question, and one that the book addresses deeply. Why this book is valuable. Now, what's powerful about Power, Pleasure, and Pain is its ability to break down these historical patterns and link them to the present. You're not just reading about ancient Rome or Enlightenment philosophy, you're seeing how these ideologies are alive today. The book uncovers how sexual violence and control have been systematically woven into the fabric of societies from ancient times right up to the modern era. It's about understanding not just the individual predators, but the systems that protect them, whether it's in royal courts, religious institutions, or today's corporate and entertainment worlds. Through these historical lenses, we also explore movements like #MeToo that are beginning to dismantle these structures. The fight for justice is far from over, but as the book demonstrates, we are in the midst of a cultural shift where legal reforms are finally addressing these long-standing issues. It's more than a history lesson. It's a guide to understanding and supporting change today. What's next? If you want to dive deeper, I suggest picking up Power, Pleasure, and Pain, a study of abuse through time. It's available now, and trust me, it will change the way you think about power, pleasure, and control. We've even got some exclusive content coming up on the channel where we'll be exploring the book's case studies in even more detail, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to the Real Crime Diary so you don't miss any updates. Let's keep this conversation going, because understanding the past is key to changing the future.